This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. I'm speaking with Lynn Rogoff. She's a filmmaker and producer of television for over 40 years, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Filmmaker Lynn Rogoff is my guest. I asked her to be on the show because I grew up watching one of her shows, a show called Big Blue Marble back in the 1970s. I thought it was a wonderful children's show from what I consider the golden age of television and also of children's television. But I'd like to give my guests a few minutes to say a little bit about themselves. So, Lynn, welcome. And if you could just give a couple of minutes background about who you are and what you've done.
So I've been working in film and television, as you say, for several decades. And I started out in children's television after graduating graduate school. And so we worked in children's television for quite a number of years, doing Big Blue Marble and Sesame Street. And then I did ABC weekend specials. And then I developed a company called Americans, which was an attempt to focus on real children in American history who had done heroic deeds when they were children. So that was the caveat. You had to have done something heroic when you were a child. And so we developed that as a weekend specials for ABC. And then I went to California and we developed it as a CD-ROM series. And we launched McGraw-Hill Home Interactive on CD-ROM in 1996. We had launched with their flagship product, and we did a game called Pony Express Rider that launched a new division of McGraw-Hill Home Interactive. And now I'm working on a project called Bird Woman, which is actually about a teenage girl, but we're really telling the story of her whole life. And we're doing it I wrote it as a screenplay, but we're doing it as a podcast, a drama, unfolding on the internet. And if that can work, we will move it into the television or movie medium.
Well, what draws you to children's programming? Are you someone who wanted to be a teacher, but you just were more artistic, or what?
That's a good question. You know, we had graduated NYU School of the Arts, and the day after we graduated, we were offered this job with Big Blue Marble. And we just fell into it. It was a group of us that were working in graduate school together. And they asked us to record and produce comedy for this international television series. And I had, in fact, as an undergraduate, studied literature and had gotten a license to teach, but I did not teach at that time. So I was interested in being a filmmaker. And but then after Big Blue Marble, I started working on Sesame Street. So we did films for Sesame Street. So I got very interested in this whole world of children's television. Mainly as a filmmaker, it's easier to get work in the beginning in children's television than it is in adult television. So at that time, it was easier to get into. And so we started working in children's television.
Well, let me just ask you about Sesame Street, because I remember as a child a lot of the films they did. And just a couple of months ago, when I was home one afternoon, I just happened to be flipping the dial, just having some lunch, and I saw now Sesame Street has a lot of the digital kind of animation. Back when it started, it was just puppets. But I remember there was little films. One gem of a film was Vivaldi's Guitar Concerto it was called The Sad Flower. Did you do that film?
No, I wish I did. So we did one called Rhythm. And it was an attempt to explain the concept of rhythm. So you heard a doctor listening to somebody's heart. You heard a band. Playing different instruments. You heard a pile driver. And so we were exposing children to the concept of rhythm. That was one of the films that we did, for Sesame Street. And then we did another one about playing jacks and solving problems by playing jacks. That one of the jacks falls into a crevice, and how do you get it out of the crevice? And one of the children comes up with a solution of a magnet and able to retrieve the jack with a magnet and solve the problem. So Sesame Street had very strong protocols on what they wanted each segment to be about. You had a choice of 24 different concepts, and would ask you as an independent to develop a concept based on any one of these protocols. So we had a free reign in what we were interested in producing films about. They would be short films, and so usually they came about because of our interests. So the magnet story came about because I dropped my keys at the post office, and I couldn't figure out how to get it. I think I used the magnet at that time. So we said, oh, that's a great little Sesame Street story.
Yeah.
So we tried to use real life events. And another one, my father was a veterinarian, and I grew up around animals. And so we had a little story about a fly. Have you seen people who are blind walking with animals, right?
Yeah.
And they're animals. And oftentimes you want to pet the animal, and you're not supposed to.
Yeah.
And so the blind woman explains to this child what the animal is doing. And the child is worried about them crossing the street. And she explains to them how they are able to cross the street without seeing.
Yeah.
And listen to the cars, and when the cars go in front of them, then the whole dog knows not to go in the street. So it was a little moment of an interaction with a child and a blind person and a dog. So Sesame Street had very strong set of educational guidelines that they were trying to expose children to, and they still do.
Mm-hmm.
They had done a lot of research on how you educate a child through media. So
did you act mostly as the writer, the producer, or the director, or did you do all of these for these films?
So we would, the group that I was part of, we would, in Sesame Street and Big Blue Marble, we would take turns being director, and one week I would direct, and the next week I would write and produce, and another week someone else would direct, and we would write and produce. So we would take turns directing.
Uh-huh.
So Big Blue Marble had another set of protocols in that they were seeing themselves as an international show, and they were hoping, and they did air it around the world. Mm-hmm. So the problem that they had was that they didn't want to be using language too much, because then they would have to voice over, or they would have to, put subtitles. Yeah. If the people don't know English all around the world.
Yeah.
So our problem was to come up with comedy that was gags that were not using voice. Mm. So we did a lot of visual comedy, and we did a lot of. That's actually how I came up with this history. We had a history series, funny moments in history. We would make silly events that took place. How did Benjamin Franklin discover electricity? He gets hit by electricity and he turns, black with soot. So it was little silly. We would do silly takeoffs on historical moments, or we did one about unicycles where we found somebody who had a large collection of unicycles. You know what a unicycle is?
Yeah.
And he let us use them, and we did little dramas about kids using unicycles to cart each other around, or play with each other, or pick each other up. So we had to be very inventive. That was really the biggest And it was exhausting because we were constantly making comedy. There was no rest.
Well,
one week you were directing, and next week you were writing the new one, and you would constantly have to come up with new concepts.
Well, I do recall the Big Blue Marble having those segments. And I want to get back to Big Blue Marble a bit later, though. I want to just talk a bit more broadly about your career here. You mentioned the ABC weekend specials. Growing up, I remember there were the after-school specials, so that was something different. You weren't doing like the disease of the week with, the teenager whose mother had cancer kind of thing.
The weekend specials was a short period, tended to be more classically oriented. In other words, they would they might do a story based on Lewis Carroll, or they might do a story based on Little Women. It was a short, a more classically oriented time slot rather than a disease of the week. And I had come to them, I had already developed this Kids in American History. And I had developed one about a young girl during the American Revolution up here in New York. She had Sybil Ludington. She had done a ride longer and harder than Paul Revere's. And they were very interested in that story. And so we developed that. And then they had also, ABC at that time owned ABC Sports.
Yeah.
And they were interested. One of the people in the New York Jets' son had saved his mother in an auto accident and pushed her up the hill. The car fell over the hill, and they wanted me to develop that story because they already owned ABC Sports.
Yeah.
So you have to work with what the producers want. And so that was another segment that I produced. I wrote for them. Mm-hmm. And so I did 3 of them for them, and then lo and behold, they were acquired by another company called Cap Cities at that time. Yeah. And the whole series was reversed back to me.
Mm-hmm. When you say that these were short time slots, we're not talking like 3 minutes like the Schoolhouse Rock.
Half an hour story.
Okay, half an hour. Okay, so were these mostly live action then?
Yes.
Okay, with actors. Okay. And how you said you did? You yourself did 3, but I'm assuming there was a longer series with other.
Yeah, the whole series of various producers and writers that came along prior to me that had been doing weekend specials, and it was a genre. I don't know how long it lasted for, but I don't recall. Yeah. But it was a genre where ABC on the weekend was always a time when ABC, they tried to pull out their most interesting, and there was children's material. And the weekend, they had to produce more educational kinds of material.
Yeah.
Classy material. So they would try and do something a little classier.
Wasn't it like an FCC rule that there had to be X amount of hours of educational programming? Does that still exist in American television?
Well, I happen to have been reading the Children's Television Act recently for getting ready for your interview. And what I came across was that in the 70s, when Big Blue Marble was being developed, there was research being done that said on the children that a child could not tell the difference between a commercial and the program. And they couldn't tell when a commercial came on that they were trying to persuade them to buy cereal or coffee or cake or cookies. They didn't understand the difference. The young child doesn't understand the difference between a commercial and a program. So they, many of these television shows would start being produced by Strawberry Shortcake.
Yeah.
It was also food.
Yeah.
They moved the advertisement into the program.
Yeah. It was things like He-Man and the Thundercats. They were basically glorified commercials for a half hour.
It was getting very sinister. Children's television was getting very sinister in its attempt to dominate the children's mind with things that they had to go buy.
Yeah.
And so the Children's Television Act attempted to control that by saying, number one, you have to advertise. You have to say, oh, you know, we'll be back in a moment. Here's a message that we're going to pause for.
Yeah.
So if the child would understand, this is a message, and the other thing was a program. Mm-hmm. So that was their first attempt at trying to differentiate between a program and an advertisement. And later on, that's when Big Blue Marble came along. You know, they said, well, we'll give this away because ITT was a gigantic international conglomerate, and they wanted to get good press, mm-hmm. I guess, on themselves. And so this was an attempt to use their cachet as an international company to do an international show, okay. which had never been done before. And of course, this was soon after the Big Blue Marble image that they had gotten when they went into space.
Right.
So it was a concept to try and do international. So, right now, children's programming has never really been regulated really well. It's still problematic. They still, because the government doesn't want to go in and regulate television and tell them, oh, you have to have X number of hours of educational, and they attempted this. And then, Nickelodeon and Viacom said, well, what is educational television? Is Dora the Explorer educational? Is SpongeBob educational? So they would try and pass these programs off as educational.
Yeah,
that's how they got through it. But in the world of educational programming, like Sesame Street and Big Blue Marble, there were very strong protocols for what is a definition of education. You can't just say, okay, you see, a young girl, animated young child using a couple of words of Spanish. That doesn't mean that you're really teaching them Spanish.
Yeah. Let me ask a question before we get into Big Blue Marble. It seems to me, as a kid, I was born in 1965, so I grew up in the 1970s, and one of the things that I remember about the Sesame Streets and the Zooms and the Electric Company and Big Blue Marble and even things like Captain Kangaroo and whatnot is that, and there was a show called The Patchwork Family that was similar to the Muppets. They seem to think that the children were not just a bunch of dumb-ass consumers in the making. And you talk about the 1980s and the switch over to all of these, G.I. Joe suddenly got a TV show and all this stuff. Do you think that in the 70s there was more that, oh, these are little people and let's treat them, as if they're not dummies?
Well, I taught a course in television, and I invited one of the executives from ABC to speak in my class. And what he said very straightforwardly to us was that television is an advertising. Yeah. The purpose of television is to sell you advertising. The programming that exists between the ads is really just filler for the ads. That's how ABC makes their money. That's how NBC makes it. CBS, they all make their money on that business model of advertising.
Yeah.
And tremendous money in advertising. So that's what if you go to television, commercial television, and expect something else, then you're going to get disappointed because that's not what they're there to do. They're there to sell advertising.
Yeah. I'm not sure about all the particular countries, but I know, like in Europe, you have the BBC and a lot of other state-funded television. They weren't commercial television. I don't know if you're an expert on it, But have you seen children's programming in other countries, and is it better generally than what we have now? From 1980s on.
I spent some time in Israel, and I worked on the Israeli Sesame Street, which is called Rogoff Sum is Sesame, and they had their own version of what the Sesame Street was. Instead of you living background, living in the garbage can, you lived in Volkswagen. And instead of being a dirty Muppet, he was like a porcupine. So each one of these countries have Sesame Street like show. Many of them do, and many of them have state-run television, which offers these programs. And nowadays, with Sky Television and Dish, you get the same programming all over the world with the satellite. So you could go to Israel or Argentina. I was in Argentina, and you'll see American programs there. So it's a very small planet that we're living in now. And the state-run television, like in communist countries, they want to control the message. So they may have not as much money spent, but they may have a television program here or there. They'll have interview television and game shows, but they won't put the money into programming that we put in here. Yeah. I mean, England, for example, has a great system where they give a lot of money to filmmakers to produce programming, and they have a big budget for their state-run programming. But that is, here in America, we don't have that. If you're a filmmaker and you want to make a show, you have to raise the money independent.
Yeah. Let's then talk about the Big Blue Marble and your involvement. You talked about how it was created by ITT, which back then was a huge company. From what I looked up a couple of weeks ago when I first contacted you, it's apparently gone through several boughts and solds, and it's a much smaller company now. How did you get involved with it? Were you instrumental in creating the show, or were you brought on with someone else's vision of it?
Apparently, there was a small cadre of men who had approached ITT, and ITT had agreed to do this show. And then we were brought in at the beginning to do comedy for them. And then some of us in the team, we had a team, I don't remember, about a dozen or so of us. Some who were cameramen went on to shoot around the world in different countries. They would shoot documentaries. So we were sort of a pool of, new graduates from film school making this programming for them. And then some of them would go on to do the documentaries. So it was a fluid situation in that sense. But we were not involved in the very beginning. I happened to have known one of the editors. I knew the head editor of the show. And so I went to him after the show closed down, and I said, I'd like to get a reel of some of my work. And he gave me a few of the projects, and they're up on my website now, where you can watch all Big Blue Marble comedy segments. And but the editor died a few years ago, and I, in fact, there are people in network television that call me. They want to get the rights to Big Blue Marble. And I said, well, no, everybody's gone. Nobody could find anybody that was the core original team. So I don't know what happened to all the guys that started it, if they're even alive. I don't even think they're alive anymore.
So ITT doesn't own the rights?
We don't know what happened. You know, I imagine they might own the rights. I don't know the liner title.
Uh-huh.
It's the liner title. Who owns the actual show? I'm sure that ITT, might have the copyright, but it's so many iterations ago that what ITT was then and what ITT is now.
Yeah.
I mean, it was International Telephone and Telegraph.
Yeah.
Gave us contact for telephone calls abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the first in the 70s to start digital telephone calling. So they were way ahead of their time. But they were also in the aerospace industry. They were in a lot of industries. They were a very, very big company. But they slowly were bought out or dissipated.
So are there no full 30-minute shows left anywhere in someone's vault or anything?
Nobody's been able to find them. Isn't that amazing? I mean, this guy who I knew, the editor, probably had some of them.
Yeah.
But, he used to live in my neighborhood, so I would go over there and edit some of the footage with him, to get some of my reel. But I don't know what happened to all the rest of the footage. I just don't know.
Yeah,
it's
it's a shame because you hear of shows like Doctor Who. There's some missing episodes from the beginning of that series. Some of these shows from the 60s and 70s, people didn't think they could ever make money off of it after the first or second airing, so they wiped clean a lot of those things.
Right. So that's this was all shot on 16mm film.
Okay.
So that was all that there was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have all that footage. There's a negative somewhere. I don't, the problem is that these companies dissolve and nobody's being the caretaker of it.
Yeah. Well, let me just state that I contacted you via a Facebook page for the Big Blue Marble, where they had a pen pal. It's a pen pal page for Big Blue Marble, and one of the unique things about the show was that you could, a girl in Wyoming could write to a girl in Israel, who could write to a girl in Australia, who could write to a girl in Argentina, and there were the little comedy inserts, but as I recall, the biggest, like you said, were the documentary segments where you might go have Bobby in Boston and Jose riding the Pampas in Argentina, and they would contrast the lifestyles of the two boys or the two girls or whatnot. You were never involved in that? You were just the little inserts in between?
I myself was doing the inserts.
Yeah.
But the colleagues were shooting, would go around the world. One of my friends at that time owned a 16mm camera. Mm-hmm. So if you owned a camera, that made you very valuable. Uh-huh. So you and your camera got at least to go around the world and shoot footage. So that's how that happened. They have camera will travel.
Well, one of the more famous, alumni of your show is a fellow named Rick Berman, who became famous in the 80s for Star Trek: The Next Generation. Was he what the?
Yeah, he was one of the producers.
Yeah. Oh, and was he one of the people in charge of the documentary portions?
The producers oversaw everything. Uh-huh. So they oversaw the documentary and the comedy and the pen pal. The pen pal concept was very clever. Uh-huh. And who would have thought that decades later, now that we have the internet, that all these people were so moved and impressed by this fact that they could write to somebody in another country and stay pen pals with them, that they now search for their pen pals as they're adults. They have children of their own, and they're on this quest to find their pen pals.
Yeah.
So it was a very, at that time there was no internet. You couldn't really, it was expensive to travel. It was expensive to call people. but you could always write a letter.
Yeah.
And somehow ITT organized this whole pen pal system.
Yeah.
So if you, Dan, were 8 years old, you wrote them, I want a pen pal, they would send you an address for a pen pal.
Yeah.
That was very clever, because that is really what's the legacy there.
Yeah, and as I said, that's how I found the Facebook page for the pen pals. It reminded me actually of a famed film series called 7 Up, directed by Michael Apted, where he follows the lives of people over, now I think next year is going to be 63 up, and one of the people has died. And just looking at some of the stories on the Facebook page, you see some of the people have been writing for 35, 40 or more years. Other people, are saying, I knew Deborah Jones from the Outback, and they're trying to find them online. That was one of the things that always stuck with me about the show was that it seemed to be ahead of its time in, as you said, anticipating, not knowingly, but sort of anticipating what was to come with instant communication around the world.
Yeah, well, I think ITT was definitely in the forefront of that concept. I mean, they understood international communication. That was their business. And so they, and the fact that they wanted to contribute to children's television in their way, which was to provide children with an international communication, provide children with the ability to understand what it's like to live in another continent, what it's like to grow and play in another country. So they were trying to encourage this concept of a global planet. Yes. And nobody had done that at this point. I mean, the concept of the global planet was not really in the people's minds. Even though they had gone to the moon and they had shot this picture, this idea of a global village that we now, you and I can talk, you're in Texas, I'm in New York, at the same exact time. If you were in Pakistan, I could talk to you at the same time. There's no, time is not a divider between us any longer. So we're instant communication. They didn't have that at that concept at this time. We did, when we would get footage from Vietnam, it would be days later we would see what was going on in Vietnam. Here you could watch the war in real time.
Yeah. Let me just ask about some of the segments that you produced. Were they all live action?
Yeah.
So you would write, I guess, a 3 or 5 minute little skit or a scene. How did you find the actors to act for them? Were they people that you knew personally? Were they part of an acting troupe? Or did you hire individuals for each segment that were totally different?
Well, because I was a theater director, I studied theater directing. And so I knew a lot of actors.
Yeah.
And so I was able to bring them in. And of course, television is a great opportunity for these actors. Mm-hmm. So they loved the idea of doing it. And of course, even though it was a small independent shoot, it was still working in television. And you ended up having something on film of your work.
Were the actors mostly adult or children or a mixture?
No, the actors were mostly adults. We rarely got a child actor. I could find, that's a good question. The children were either, we went to a community like the unicycling community. We had to find kids who could ride on unicycles. Yeah. And then maybe we went to a school, an acting school, and we said, we have a little skit, and your children do this skit for us. Uh-huh. So we had a skit where musical skit, and they walk into the Central Park pond, mm-hmm. and they come out in silly little, dressed in these silly little costumes, and fish comes out of one of the instruments. So sometimes we would do some Very funny, obviously funny moments, and sometimes we would do something lyrical.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't necessarily, you're falling over laughing.
So these were sort of interstitial sections that were just sort of relief from the main thing about a kid in Africa, say.
And you had 3 or 4 documentaries, and then we could say each documentary was 10 minutes, and then you had the interstitials in between. So if the show is 56 minutes, you had 16 minutes of interstitial.
Big Blue Marble, that was a syndicated show, which is different than what Sesame Street was, which was owned by public television. What was the difference between working for the two different types of companies? Was there a more lowest common denominator pressure when you were doing Big Blue Marble, or was it the quality pretty much similar?
Well, Sesame Street had a book that they gave you that you had to conform to.
A Bible, in other words.
Yeah, in other words, if you had to say, well, we're going to do a unit on critical thinking skills. So this jack, finding the jack and using the string and tying the string to the magnet is all how do you solve problems. Mm-hmm. While Big Blue Marble was much more free reign.
Okay.
You just came up with comedy segments that you proposed to the producers, the group, and if they liked it, well, they said, okay, go ahead and shoot it. So it was much more open. Big Blue Marble was, we didn't have to be educational in that sense. We didn't have, the comedy was intended to be lighthearted.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier how I grew up in New York City, and for part of its run, Big Blue Marble was on PBS, and for part of it was on, I think, Channel 9 or Channel 11 here in New York. But was that a national switch, or was it that because it's syndicated, it just varied? And was there any difference over the course of the 7 or 8 years the show ran? Was there any difference in the way the show was produced? That did certain producers come in and say, well, we're going to go this way, that way? Or
well, you have to remember that ITT was giving the show away. Mm-hmm. You know, they were, in other words, they gave it to WNET.
Yeah.
But they gave it to PBS. They weren't making money off the show.
Yeah.
In other words, they saw it as either a write-off or a goodwill gesture. So they didn't really need to show a profit on the show. Mm-hmm. So they could do it, you know, commercial-free. Then they didn't have to have commercial. If you don't need to make money, if you're giving the show to WNET, they don't have to have commercials because they got the show for free. Mm-hmm. Or if they, you know, do commercial at the beginning and the end, it's money in their pocket. It's not money. The show didn't cost them anything. Mm-hmm. So that model is very different than if you're children's television, even Children's Television Workshop, which owns, it's not public television, owns, they licensed, Children's Television Workshop licensed Sesame Street to public television. They don't own it. Mm. Public television gets a license to air it. Mm. Just, they sold a license now to HBO to air Sesame Street.
So Sesame Street is leaving PBS?
No, it's on both.
Oh, okay.
But first, HBO got their first airing.
Okay.
So they'll produce a year, let's say they'll produce a season, 2019, and they'll show it first on HBO, and then the second run is on PBS.
Okay. So how many...
The thing like Sesame Street is there are things like Sesame Street Park and the toys. They have a division between the profit and the non-profit division.
Yeah.
Children's Television Workshop.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard recently that they actually make a mint selling, the Elmo and the Cookie Monster and all the
on the sheets, and it's on the pillow towels and the pillowcases, and everybody paying a license for all those images.
Yeah. So how many years did you work on Big Blue Marble? Were you through the whole run?
No. We moved on. I worked for a year or two, and then I started doing other things.
Uh-huh.
And but some other people kept shooting.
Uh-huh.
The ones who had the cameras, they kept shooting documentary footage. Uh-huh. But most of us would move on. It was very time consuming and exhausting, uh-huh, because they were asking us to do a whole season in one summer.
Okay. So you would come up with, say 20 interstitial segments that would be used for 20 episodes, but you'd film them within a few weeks' time.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
But there was a constant schedule of 1 week coming up with them, the next week shooting them, then going back to coming up. You felt life became a Big Blue Marble episode.
Yeah. Before we started this interview, I mentioned my own opinion about the internet, and I talked about the famous statement in the early 60s from the then FCC chairman, Newt Minow, said, television is a vast wasteland. And I've always thought that the 60s and 70s actually were the best era of television. I even did a show about that. Let me just ask you now about children's programming here in the 21st century, as well as online. Number one, do you think that is there any difference, or does it matter where it airs, on network television or on some popular YouTube channel?
Well, I think, right now the children have these devices in their hands, in the stroller.
Yeah.
So I see the parents handing them the phone and the tablet. They're tiny little ones. They could be 6 months old even. And I saw one the other day. I started laughing. I said, I never saw a child that young being able to manipulate these devices. So the parents have to really be careful, because the child is being fed this digital material that it doesn't really understand, except that it's colors and lights and pretty stories. And but for the problem, it turns into when they become older, then there's a lot of violence. Mm-hmm. Games, and so we did a lot of we did what you call edutainment.
Yeah.
Programs. We did produce edutainment games where we were trying to engage the young person, but at the same time try to help them discover something new or engage in some kind of new world that they were not familiar with. So recently we've been doing a series called Endanger. It was a danger games. You could find it on my website too, where you have to you go around the world and you have to help find and save an endangered animal. So you have the adventure of finding and saving the animal, and you learn about why the animal is being endangered for the first place, and you virtually solve its problems. So hopefully they get involved in some kind of social action, meaning that you become aware that you can make a difference.
Yeah.
And encourage them. But many of these shows that are being produced for children on mobile and are really mindless games. Mm-hmm. There's really no attempt except to push little pixels around.
Well, let me ask you, as someone who has an interest, you said, teaching was something that you had done. How does one break through the wall or the static of all the lowest down dumbed down entertainment that's out there? All the you look at Marvel movies and everything's blowing up and laser beam shooting out of superheroes' eyes and this and that, and everyone's wearing these skin tight clothes. And how is there a way that a 4 or 5-year-old can be engaged to actually learn? Do you have to trick a child in a sense to learn them, to get them to learn?
As a parent, have to be very engaged in your child's experiences.
Yeah.
It requires a tremendous amount of attention by the parent to what the child is consuming.
Yeah.
Because if left to their own resources, they will find the violent episodes. They will find the sexualized material. So you as a parent have a tremendous responsibility in this day and age to control what your child is consuming.
Yeah.
Much more so than before. And you look now that 25 and 35-year-olds, 45-year-olds are playing these games.
Yeah.
That, it doesn't end when you become a parent.
Yeah.
They're still interested in this violence.
Yeah. We are talking now in the year 2019, and unlike 40 plus years ago when Big Blue Marble and Sesame Street were just starting out in the 70s, there are things that would not have ever made it to broadcast television. For example, people wouldn't talk about transsexuality or transgenders, and they wouldn't talk about racism or black people being shot by policemen. Now children can go online and they see this. If you would, and I don't know how involved you are now, but how do you as an edutainment person or an edutainer, how do you engage a child that this is serious, but also to think about that? I mean, if you would say doing work on that.
That the endangered animals are serious?
Yeah.
How do you engage whether to make them think that it's important?
Yeah, well, it could be global warming, these big issues that these children are going to grow up in a world with.
Well, when we started doing the endangered series, there were people that didn't understand how this had anything to, because it was called Green Kids Media originally. Mm-hmm. And we had venture capitalists that said to us, how is this green? We don't understand how endangered animals have anything to do with green. But only in the last few years have people started to understand that animals dying because of habitat loss and destruction of the breeding grounds and food sources, that is happening because of global warming and climate change and the resources that we're sharing with overpopulation of the world. So yeah, it's very hard to make space for these concepts. I think, though, that young people see that they're going to inherit this problem. And they know it. I mean, you and I are going to be gone. When we're gone, they're going to have a hot planet that's with too many people on it and too few resources. So they know that on some level, I mean, they may not know it consciously with an attempt to do proactive solutions to end plastic or to save animals, but on some level they are learning, either in school or through news events, that they are going to inherit a planet that is going to be fraught with much uncertainty in terms of the climate and in terms of what's their ability to have a life that's not in peril. I mean, if we have droughts, we have floods, and animals are dying, so are human beings.
Let me ask you, over the course of your career, what is the one area or the one endeavor, the one project that you worked on that you are most proud of? Was it the Endangered series that you're talking about now?
Oh, God, that's a hard question. But the one that I did a film for public television called No Maps on My Taps, which was about 3 black tap dancers and Lionel Hampton, and it won Emmy Awards, it won a lot of awards. Mm-hmm. And we were the first to capture that generation of blacks that had come up through Jim Crow and had maintained their artistic vision as tap dancers. And it became a minor classic. It just was remastered and re-released last summer. So it still gets reviewed. It still has, so people still go to the theater to see it. So that's one that I'm proud of. The other, I did a lot of stories about American culture. I became very interested. I became very interested in stories about American culture. So I did another one about Emma Goldman and Ben Reitman. I did it as a play. That's another one that I'm very proud of. And then the most recent one I'm doing now is about Sacagawea and her being able to morph into a bird, and we're calling it Bird Woman, based on Indian spiritual concepts of animal spirits. So I met with a lot of Native Americans in South Dakota and in Nebraska, and so we've been developing that project for quite a long time. All these things take years.
Yeah. Let me just ask you then, as a sort of videographer of cultural anthropology, if you will, where do you think that American culture is going, at least in the entertainment or edutainment field? Do you think that, I mean, obviously most people, myself included, I'm not particularly happy with American culture in terms of a lot of things, but I'm not someone who's a totally pessimist that everything is going to hell in a handbasket thing. What do you think are some of the things that are positives going forward for the next generation of children?
Well, I think that they are more aware.
Yeah.
That there's they have to become involved.
Yeah.
Even though, despite the fact that they all want to go see Aquaman and Aquaman 2 and Iron Man and Batman, Superman, and
but yeah,
I can't even remember all the
superheroes. Yeah.
They still are. There are a small percentage of young people, and I teach college, so I see them coming up who are very concerned about their future, and they know that number one, they're in debt. And number two, from college. And number two, they need to go out and make a living. And number three, can they provide for a family? And can they get good means of work? And can they contribute to society? So there's a generation that are very concerned about that. So that's where I'm optimistic.
Well, we've talked about things you've done in the past, and we talked about things you're currently doing. If you could have, say, one major project, or has there been, say, over the course of your career, one project you'd love to do, and that if you could get the funding or you could get the backing, you could do it, and what is that?
Well, right now we're actually in the midst, as we speak, of trying to raise money for this Native American story. And that's very good.
And that's a stage play, you said?
Oh, it's a screenplay.
Screenplay, okay.
And it's called Bird Woman.
Okay.
And it's based on the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1804, but I did it from the Native American point of view.
Yeah.
I think that, number one, we haven't seen enough women as protagonists in history. And for two, we haven't really seen Native Americans as heroes. And that there is an attempt in recent months to denigrate Pocahontas as supposed to be some kind of taunt.
Yeah.
Pocahontas and Sacagawea were, in their own time, considered very heroic, fearless young women. And to say that, that there's something to put someone else down about, I think we need to rethink and re-examine American history. And we need to understand that number one, these young women that came of age in these various epochs were they made history too. It's not just, heroic men making history. There were very important young women making history at that time. And in fact, the suffragettes, even in the centennial in 1904, picked her up and built statues of her all over America. There's more statues of Sacagawea than there are any other woman in America. all around the West, all along the route for Lewis and Clark. So, we feel that history has to be retold.
And how are you going about trying to get the funding? Is it through independent funding, or are you looking to try to get a Hollywood involved, or would Hollywood just Hollywoodize it?
Well, right now we're looking more towards the independent, building up an independent method, because, Hollywood is a very closed system.
Huh.
There's a handful of people that have the money, and they want to keep the money in their hands. And I don't blame them. If I had that kind of money, access to that money, I'd want to keep it in my hands too.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to break through that. So you have to. My experience has been where you build up an independent group of people who see themselves as being doers. So we've got a group that out in the Arizona and Texas that are very involved with the legends of the West. And we're about to do an audio drama about this story. So it's very exciting to see that, we can pair up people who have similar interests, can find each other and produce material.
Well, let me just ask you a final question about the actual production of it, because I've interviewed a number of independent filmmakers who've done low budget things, some as low as $5,000 for a feature film, others under $50,000. And with the technology today, with these little handheld cameras and online editing or editing you can put on your regular PC, it's not like it was 40, even 20 years ago. So is that something that makes it easier for you to possibly film this?
Yeah, the fact that it's a historical piece.
Yeah, that would be the thing.
That is, expensive. Yeah. And the fact that it's got magical realism, the special effects, makes it expensive as well.
Yeah.
So, they have something these days called you're supposed to produce a sizzle reel. Have you heard this expression?
Yeah.
So, you have to put out money for the sizzle reel. So now we're saying, well, we could produce this audio drama.
Yeah.
And we're going to try and see where that will take us.
Yeah, it's sort of like a fishing lure to lure the fish. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Lynn Rogoff, for spending an hour or so talking about your career and future endeavors. And I will link to AmeriKids.com. That's the website. And it was a pleasure to speak to you, and good luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you. Nice speaking with you.